Evening. Hi, everyone. I'm Therese Lagama, Director of Public Programs here at the Kennedy Center, also the Chief Curator for the series. Welcome to this evening's program, which is part of our ongoing writer series, Impactful Words. And tonight, I am so pleased to welcome notable NPR music critic Ann Powers with her new book, Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell. Powers has been a music critic for more than 30 years, working for NPR, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and other publications. In the decade she has worked with NPR, she has written extensively on music and culture and appeared regularly on the All Songs Considered podcast and on news shows, including All Things Considered and Morning Edition. Her books include a memoir, Weird Like Us, My Bohemian America, Good Booty, Love and Sex, Black and White, Body and Soul in American Music, and Piece by Piece with Tori Amos. In just a minute, Ann will be joined by Tom Huizenga, the Peabody Award-winning producer for NPR Music, and this evening's moderator. After Tom and Ann talk, they'll turn to your questions. Those were the index cards that we handed out at the entry of the theater. We'll cover as many questions as we can in our allotted time together. And if you would like to meet Ann after the show, she will be down in the lower lobby personalizing books. We're so grateful to you for joining us tonight and for supporting the series. And stay tuned, we have another very exciting announcement we'll be making in the second week of July that will be part of this writer series. Very, very exciting. Please join us in welcoming Ann Powers and Tom Huizenga to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming on this hot, hot day when you wanted to stay inside. Well, you're inside here with us. So.
You know, there could be laughing, there could be crying. You know, it's the same release, right? So, yes, thank you everybody for coming. I'm Tom Huizenga from NPR, where I've covered music as a producer and reporter and editor and critic since 1999. And I have been continually listening to Joni Mitchell's music since I was about 10, so there's only just a couple decades, right?
I have to confess that when I started this project, I did think, well, but Tom should be writing this book. He knows so much more about Joni than I do.
I've seen her 3 times, only 3 times, the first time in 1979. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Ann and her book. And what can we say about Ann Powers? One thing I can say about Ann Powers is, Ann, you've got more class than Mick Jagger, Richard Nixon, and Gomer Pyle combined. Okay, now that wasn't a lot of... Anybody get that reference? Okay, we need to... Okay, if you know where that is from, just applaud, please. Whoa, okay. We've got a few Joni Mavens. So that is, that ended up on her first live album from 1974 called Miles of Aisles, when somebody shouted that to her in the audience.
But it also applies to me.
Yes. But seriously, Ann Powers is an American treasure, in my view. She writes fluently and deeply about music and culture in a style that is effortless, and yet in its scope and its ideas, it challenges you. You may have read her in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Village Voice, her books at NPR. And I think that when you read Ann Powers, you come away a slightly different person, as if you've been on a quest. Whether she's writing about trends in country music, or whether she's writing about deep dives into artists as diverse as Beyonce and Madonna, Flora Purim, Roberta Flack, Tyler Childers, and the list could go on and on. So Anne, congratulations on your book,
Thank
Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell. We happen to have it right here. We're going to ask you, I got a lot of questions about the book, some questions from you folks later on. And like the title of your book, Traveling, Joni seemed to always be traveling, searching, looking for something. What can it be?
Yes.
And you've taken your own personal Joni journey writing this book over the last few years. And it's not like any other biography that I have read. It's not your chronological A to Z from a disembodied voice, like listing the events in the subject's life. For me, this was the most really interactive biography that I've ever read, because as the reader, I think you are on this journey with Anne, and Anne as your guide, number one, but also as a confidant working through these aspects of Joni Mitchell's life. And the book is really a hybrid of reportage and deeply thought through criticism with a splash of memoir. We get to know a little bit about your life, some things that I never even knew, which is great. So I'm curious to know why you set the book up in this very unconventional way.
Thank you for that question. Well, one reason was the subject itself, herself. I mean, Joni Mitchell is a daunting figure. She is, we know her through her music as a very vulnerable, human, often funny, tough, irreverent woman, but we also know that she suffers no fools. We know she is a legend and an icon, and fiercely protected by her most devoted fans. And it's hard to climb a mountain, the altitude changes, and you gotta have the right gear. And I knew that I needed to share my own, let's call it a struggle at first, to get my arms around this subject, to get up that mountain. I read a book that I loved early on in my process by Jeff Dyer. It's called Out of Sheer Rage, and it's about not writing a book about D.H. Lawrence. I recommend it to all of you. It's very funny. It's very, he makes himself a character in that. It's really like about writer's block and many things, but it's about this very thing, which is, he loves D.H. Lawrence, but he also knows D.H. Lawrence has a place in the world already before he ever touches the subject, right? And he foregrounds that in the book. He never writes the biography of D.H. Lawrence, except he did, because that's the book we're reading. And after I read that book, I thought to myself, this is what I need to do. I can't become transparent, so I have to be transparent in the second meaning of that word about my own feelings, my own feelings of intimidation even about Joni. So that was one reason. And then the other reason is because there's a very, very beautiful shelf of books about Joni out there. Some of you who love her have probably read these books, Reckless Daughter by David Yaffe, and Will You Take Me As I Am by Michelle Mercer, and Malcolm Marome's amazing book-length interviews with Joni. So I wanted to be able to put something on that shelf that had its own place and made its own mark. Just repeating what others have done, you can find a great conventional biography in Yaffe's book. So I wanted to use my skills as a critic and as someone who loves to put things in context and make associations to give you a different way into the many Joni Mitchells in this book.
Well, I have to say, Anne, that after reading the book, I came away with a richer and fresher understanding of what it means to be a Joni Mitchell fan in 2024. I think, you guided me through kind of affirming her genius, but also pointing out and calling her on her missteps, and some deeply thought out writing in the book about that. I'd like to have you read a little bit about the book. The introduction is called Drawing the Maps, and I love that. It's like your cartographer's affirmation and plan for the book. And I'd love for you to read a little bit beginning on page 3, I think, right?
Okay. As I immersed myself in the landscapes and soundscapes where Mitchell landed and made her music, I had to keep uprooting myself, rejecting any settled stances about who this woman is and why her music is so special. I needed to keep moving because that's what she's always done. What often happens to legends like Mitchell, not as people necessarily, but as subjects of the world's impassioned interest, is that they get stuck within the edifice of fame. In some ways, they become monuments themselves, solid structures built from the aspects of themselves that others love most. Joni Mitchell, the misunderstood musical genius, the emblematic free woman, the sad girl's or boy's best imaginary friend, has solidified into a series of qualities and traits rather than remaining a dynamic force running on both magic and flaws. She is open tunings, confessional songwriting, jazz rock. She is a gammon old crone, a childless mother, a true blue lover, leaving before the sun comes up. She is always in her own category, so relatable, ultimately unknowable. In truth, she's all of these things, but reducing her to any of them turns her into stone. Mitchell's music chases and challenges society's assumptions about what a woman and an artist can be. Any singular view of her artistry and her influence diminishes it. I'm taking Mitchell's lead on this. I feel sometimes like I'm a multi-phrenic person, she once said, apparently inventing a term psychologists would later use to describe the condition of having many selves and self-representations that conflict. Mitchell put it more plainly. Will the real me stand up, you know? Someone pointed out to me, by the way, that that's what Eminem says in The Real Slim Shady. So hey, Eminem to Joni connection, Joni to Eminem connection. My goal has been to follow Joni Mitchell as she's drifted and flown and to chart the rhythms of her inquiries. Her self-conception begins in movement. When asked to define herself, she rarely calls herself a musician first, saying that since she was a child, she's been a dancer and a painter, shimmying with the boys and the bad girls in a Saskatoon dive, wrecking her stockings, reaching her arms overhead to make brushstrokes on canvas, opening up unimagined vistas with a smear of paint. A portrait hardens and becomes lifeless when its maker loses track of the breath, the living presence of her subject, a constantly shifting thing, blurry, then focused, then dissolving, then clear, then different. The light has changed and strives for something absolute. A map maker must be open to new routes. People are not definitive, neither is any one story. That is the point of Mitchell's songs. Life is stranger and bigger than that. And people, even geniuses, are smaller, human, always incomplete. Every legend is also one of us. Thank you.
That's another thing I really like about the book is that, you know, for someone like me, the lifelong Joni Mitchell fan, it's like, oh, she can do no wrong, right? And everything she does is genius and it's great and everything. And this is a book that is, for me at least, it's Joni Mitchell kind of warts and all, and making missteps, making some decisions that were perhaps not so great. And I think it's interesting to realize that, you know, her stock just keeps rising over the last 10, 15 years, and especially now since she's made this comeback and everything. But there were times in her life where, you know, her records were highly criticized and not selling very well. And I remember even in the 70s as she turned, a little bit toward jazz. Some of my friends just left her pretty much. But so thank you for all of the Jonis.
Well, it's interesting, Tom, because I think that Joni herself was sometimes frustrated by that, but on the other hand, she seemed to drive herself toward that. And this is a key quality of Joni Mitchell's art, I think, and also her life story, which is that there's a kind of an advance and retreat and an embrace and a rejection. And that's even in the musicality, her musicality and the structures of her songs. So, it's hard to imagine a Joni Mitchell who would have been like a Madonna, blockbuster artist, commandeering crowds of 1 million. There always is a bit of the elite about her audience, I guess, or maybe the way she imagined her audience even.
Right. So again, the book is traveling on the path of Joni Mitchell, and that leads me to believe that it's almost like you were with Joni on this journey.
Behind her, a little behind her.
Yeah, but in the book you say, I've got it written down here, as I went through these phases of following her, I found myself feeling closer to her as an artist and a person. And yet, very early on, when you were writing the book, you made a decision not to interview Joni.
Mm-hmm. I did. I mean, in some ways it was a practical decision at first. I started writing this book not long after, only a couple years after she had this near-fatal aneurysm, and it was unclear whether she could even do an interview.
That was in 2015.
Yeah, she had the aneurysm in 2015. I started, really, the first seeds of the book started in 2016. So, but, as I embarked on the journey, I really realized in order to do the things I've already spoken about tonight and kind of manifest this multiplicity of stories and create and not exact, maybe an instability, I don't know if that's the right word, but just, all these different views, that was not what an official biography would be. I mean, this book is also in some ways about what biography is, and in that I'm inspired by the obvious people like Janet Malcolm and Hermione Lee, biographers who are incredible and also have interrogated the idea of biography. And I think biography can be a kind of like a freezing, like I said in that passage, and I just really resisted that. But also there was the problem of like when I was starting out, as I write about in the introduction, I had some fear. I also had some hostility going in. And so that also made me reluctant to talk to her. In a way, I was a fan in the kind of average way, but I also thought, oh, why is she so worshipped? And, I had to go on the road to get to that place, So, yeah, it took me a little while to, different than you, though.
Right, we come from such different sets of circumstances, Joni would say. Me being kind of like the lifelong fanboy, and you coming to Mitchell's music a little bit later in your life. And now, of course, that you have this, amazing view of having written the book. I'm wondering about your earliest experiences with her music. Do you remember, like, some of the first times you heard her music and what you thought of it?
I do remember. The first Joni Mitchell song that I loved was Raised on Robbery. So my parents, they're no longer with us, but they were older. They had their children older, and they were full-on big band era types. And I grew up listening to not only the big bands, but like the Mills Brothers and the Andrews Sisters. So when Raised on Robbery was out and I was just a kid, that was a familiar sound to me, but also told this very intriguing and unusual story of a woman, a free woman, at a bar, talking in a rapid-fire monologue in an Andrews Sisters style multi-track harmonies of Joni's voice, basically coming onto this man, probably, honestly, a sex worker, and I was enchanted by the familiar sound that related to the music of my childhood, but also who is this woman? You know, who is this character? Can I be like that woman? Do I want to be like that woman? And so I just love that character.
And you're kind of a rocker, and that song is really kind of a rocker also in its
Yeah,
own way.
it is.
So.
It is. And then, but at the same time, Help Me, so Court and Spark era, that was ubiquitous on 70s radio when I was a kid. And that song I was a little troubled by as an uptight Catholic girl. I don't know. I mean, I think that's a very sexy song, and it also felt kind of louche and just, I don't know, you know, it's just very Warren Beatty and Shampoo or something like that. So that was a little scary to me, you know, that was a little like, I will never achieve. So Raised on Robbery, oh, maybe I can be that woman, that woman who gets thrown off at
Rebellious.
the end too, right? That
Yeah.
the end of that song is the man walking away. And she's
Oh, you're
like,
mean when you're loaded.
yeah. Exactly. But I could never be that woman, and Help Me.
Was there a Joni light bulb moment for you? Like, okay, now I'm really getting what she's all about.
Well, I'm going to turn this on you because you have to tell your Joni light bulb story, and then you have to tell your hissing story. Your
Okay, who
youthful
wants to go
story.
first?
Okay, I'll say, I think my Joni, I don't know if there really was a Joni light bulb story. I think what happened after my interest in those singles was I was trying really hard to learn about classic rock, I guess, you know, as a person slightly younger than that generation, checking things out of the library. I have a kind of memory of checking out Huizenga at the same time as Neil Young's Decade, and getting kind of into it, but then being like, again, like, that's too grown up for me. That's a little too grown up for me. I had a friend who was really into Dylan, so I think I had in high school, and I had a sideways way into Joni without knowing it because I loved Blood on the Tracks. That was his favorite record. This kid only dated redheads, and you know, that's the first line of that. Yeah, is her hair is still red? And and only much later did I learn that that album was inspired by Blue, thus Tangled Up in Blue. And so later then I got into Blue as every young woman does, I think. But yeah, so share your story then.
I'll try to make it brief. See, I think the first time I heard a Joni Mitchell song was around a campfire when we camped in the same place near a lake every year, and I was about probably 8 or so, 7 or 8, and there was a teenage woman and her friend. They both played guitar, and they came around the campfire one night. She would later become kind of like a girlfriend of my brother, my older brother. She had a beautiful voice, and she sang Michael from Mountains.
Wow,
from the
man, I was like so ready for Circle Game right then.
No, and I thought, wow, this is just a fantastic song. I didn't search Joni Mitchell's music out right after that, but shortly after that. But really the light bulb moment was For the Roses, a record that I bought when it came out. I was about 12, and it would take way too long to explain, but that's when Joni started really kind of being my life coach. And I never had sisters, so she was almost kind of like the older sister that I never had. And I think she actually, I think I became a better man because of Joni Mitchell giving me this view into a woman's world.
Right,
you know,
and what have you? I mean, you're listening to songs about groupies and all kinds of stuff.
And teaching you that you can be open with your feelings,
Well, that's
teaching
very
that you
true.
need critical thinking about
Yeah.
relationships and things like that.
Yeah.
So this theme in your book of traveling and journeys is so strong. I think we should try to get through some of her music. I mean, we're not
Yes.
going to get through all of it, that's for sure. I'll set us up a little bit. The first album is 1968, and I think that on these early albums, you can definitely hear the influence of the folk music scene that was around Joni and that predated her a little bit. And I don't know if any of you have checked out some of the archive material that she's been releasing over the past few years, but there's some really fantastic archive songs that she has before she was actually writing her own songs. And she would be the first to admit, actually, that she was actually mimicking Joan Baez, Buffy St. Marie,
Yes.
Judy Collins, and stuff
Yeah.
like that. still on those early records doing very interesting stuff with Joni's weird chords, or
Yes.
her chords of inquiry, as she
Yeah.
calls them,
Yeah.
these odd guitar tunings and strange things with her voice. But then we get to her fifth album in 1974, which is For the Roses, and something's lost, but something's gained, you could argue, with this album, and that a little of that folk sound kind of falls away. What's happening with her in this point on her musical journey?
I get nervous when I have to like talk about specifics, so this is where I call up the track listing for the Roses. So talk amongst yourself. But I think, because oh look, error, Wikipedia's down. Great. Okay, we have to wing it.
I know it by heart.
Has that ever happened before? Oh my God. Well, yeah, it's one thing that's happening musically, I think. People talk about Joni's jazz phase, her jazz years, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But she's already got jazz players on this record, and the arrangements are changing. You referred to it when we were talking before as chamber music, chamber pop. Maybe she invented chamber pop at that moment, you know?
It just feels like some of the songs are not so intensely personal as they were on Blue, the album that preceded it.
Right.
And you get songs like, well, for me, one of the interesting songs on it is Bar and Grill, which is another, almost a little bit of an ode to the Andrews sisters.
Yeah.
Three waitresses all wearing black diamond earrings, talking about zombies and Singapore slings, that whole
Right.
thing. But this seems like kind of a transitional record for her.
It's interesting. I feel like among the Joni heads, I don't know how many Joni heads are out there, but among the real Joni heads, what's happening now is a shift, like blues cool, but For the Roses. Like that's become the new blue to some people.
Oh, well.
In a way that really makes sense in that they are both, I would say they are both very personal records, and the observational is underrated on Blue, and maybe the personal is a little overlooked on For the Roses. So they're of a piece. Blue she made during a time when in her personal life she was going through a lot of transition, which many of us know if we know anything about her biography. She had broken off her relationship with Graham Nash and was becoming involved with James Taylor. She'd done a lot of traveling, European traveling, so we have these snapshots like Carrie of her time in Greece. But there are also these very soul-bearing songs, and the sound of Blue is very soul-bearing. With For the Roses, this is after her relationship with Taylor had disintegrated in light of, he would say, I think agree, of his, I'm going to say alleged for legal reasons, but his alleged heroin use. And also his other reasons, which then led him to marry Carly Simon, not too far after that. She retreated, Joni, to her house in the Sunshine Coast up in BC, Canada, where she built a house, which she called a monastery. And she talks in one of the songs about the trees singing to her. Which song you know?
That's the title track where she talks about it's just the arbutus rustling and the bumping of the logs.
Right, and I think she went there to recover emotionally, both from her personal heartbreak and also kind of the overwhelming experience of fame, as she, which.
And she talks about that, and that's her song about fame, really,
right,
is For the Roses.
Exactly, because that image is about horses running
right.
for a prize, but the horses are also running toward their death in the
right.
song. But what happened, I think, is that she heard it's like she heard the trees singing to her, and she started to feel that she had to create. And so that album, she is reflecting on a life she's not so sure about, and it splits the difference between the every woman story of romantic idealism and heartbreak on Blue, and this particular story of fame and confronting the machinery of the entertainment industry. And So that's what's great about that song. You know, I love a song like Blonde in the Bleachers, which is kind of both things at once, right? It's her observing a man who probably is a friend, I think, in that song, a musician, and noticing a woman who is his new companion, and kind of reflecting on the status of women as the spoils of rock and roll, and how that's not good for anybody, the woman or the man. It feels personal, but it's also telling this quintessential story that is, in my mind, a feminist story, even if she doesn't like that word.
And then speaking of feminists, there's A Woman of Heart and Mind on that record too, which is, but we could go on long about that. So then in 1974, 2 years later, we get Court and Spark, and then in that same year, Miles of Isles, the live album, which we heard a little bit of earlier. Mm-hmm. And there, for these albums, she's really got a jazz fusion outfit, Tom Scott's LA Express behind her. And one of my favorite chapters in your book is called Freedom Through Fusion. And, you know, I listened to a lot of fusion in the 70s, but I think I was just, I don't know, too Joni blind or whatever to realize her direct connection to it and to realize like what she took from it for her own needs. So you've done really great work in this chapter. I love it, and I'd love for you to read a little bit from it, if you would.
Great. This section is called Jazz Is. It's common for Joni chroniclers to call the phase she eased into after For the Roses her jazz era. I've done that myself. But even Mitchell's biggest fans, even her jazz collaborators, still can't totally agree whether her 1970s music actually fits within the art form's lineage. She herself maintains that most of the records she's released since 1972 do not entirely. Joni turned to jazz, she's often said, because the Laurel Canyon-connected masters who played on her earlier albums couldn't keep up with her latest experiments. But she was dipping in, not totally converting. Pretty typical is a remark she made to the critic Robert Hilburn in 2008. Some people thought I was trying to do jazz and not quite getting it, but I wasn't. The only thing I have in common with jazz is sometimes experimental rhythms and these wide harmonies that are outside the rules of jazz. To which I say, Joni, for once, you've underestimated yourself. In her mind, jazz was charts, rules, a certain education, and the standard compositions and techniques. She couldn't claim such expertise. Well, I know that feeling well. As the kind of music writer who craves variety, I've sometimes taken on jazz assignments, but I've never felt fully confident in doing so. Here was a point in my Joni chase where I felt like she turned around and looked at me for a minute, saying, yeah, I totally know where you're coming from. I was stuck in the jazz conundrum that Joni eventually solved for herself by simply refusing to dwell in it, as she's so often done with externally imposed definitions and limitations. I began to think that Mitchell might have felt as confused as I did about how a non-expert could fit within jazz, even on its edges. As she moved away from her old modes of musical practice, she started to expand her own sense of self, too, identifying with black men especially in ways that eventually became troubling. But she also kept her gimlet eye cast on the divisions she couldn't breach. From For the Roses onward, she became preoccupied with troubled borderlines, where unexpected alliances formed and people could transform themselves, but where custom and the law might clamp down at any moment, reasserting old divisions. She immersed herself within the supposedly liberated social milieus of 1970s Hollywood and Manhattan, and found hypocrites and lost people among the sophisticates and gurus. She became fascinated with the post-colonial collisions between white elites and the black, brown, and indigenous people they romanticized and exploited, and considered, clumsily at times, her own role in these exchanges. Aware of her own precarity on the margin between youthful beauty and funky middle age, she considered her choice to remain unsettled as a single woman and a traveler, unwilling, unable to settle down. The fusion sounds she created with her collaborators continually complicated the stories she wanted to tell within music that refuse to fit any easy definitions. Thank you.
So this fusion era lasted all throughout the 70s, right? And
Yeah.
some of, at least my, favorite records, the next one was Hissing of Summer Lawns, then Hejira, Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, and culminating in the supremely polarizing Mingus, which was from 1979, where she collaborated with, at the time, the dying jazz giant Charles Mingus. And I think that did leave her audience just perplexed, because it wasn't really jazzy enough for the jazzers, it wasn't Joni enough for the Joni fans, and
Right, it was definitely on. I invoke this phrase that the musicologist Kevin Feliz took from literary theory called the broken middle. And he has a great book on jazz fusion called Birds of Fire. And the broken middle, as he talks about it, is this space where nothing ever completely coalesces, but everything is always forming. And that is what he thinks fusion really is. And that's definitely what Joni is doing in the 70s. I mean, she's not committing to any one sound exactly. She never learned all the kind of like theory and notation and things that she should learn to be a true jazz artist. At the same time, she definitely, and on Mingus more than anywhere else, here she is writing lyrics and making new arrangements to these jazz classics by one of the titans, right? She presumes to be able to do that, yes, with permission, but I think to many jazz critics, that's just like, what are you doing, Interestingly, one fact I discovered, and this is in one of the Malcolm Marome interviews, is that at the time she was, at the beginning of these years, she was involved with the drummer John Guerin, and he's present for one of the interviews, and at one point she points to him and she says, well, he's created a system of transcription that
right.
we use in the studio so that the players can follow my paths, And I think this is like jumping to another place for a moment, but I just want to say, many people talk about Joni's private life and her many lovers, and I talk about that in the book, but I only talk about those relationships. I always talk about those relationships as what they were to me primarily. I mean, they were love affairs and they were, embodied dreams and all these things, but they were working relationships. And she, she got with people that, both as her friends and her lovers, that shared her obsessive desire to create new music and go somewhere where nobody had gone. So I think that's what she was doing during that time. And I think Mingus sounds so fresh today. It totally fits in with what's happening in vibey jazz of today, And Kamasi Washington could have made that record.
Exactly. And it's interesting that you talk about in the book, too, about how jazz is, the idea of jazz is so kind of heavily policed and
Yes.
everything. And not that I'm not no jazz expert, but when you listen to Twisted from Court and Spark,
Right.
her homage to Annie Ross of
Yes.
Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross,
Yes.
the jazz vocal trio. I mean, she's singing jazz there, in my opinion. And yet
Yeah.
some of the jazz elite are really, well, was she really doing jazz or not?
Right.
She's not really a jazz person. Jaco Pastorius, I think, actually
I
said
know.
that you quoted in your book. Like, well, she's really not jazz. But
Whatever. She's an okay musician. She's a great painter. but yeah, I mean, you can see there's a good video on YouTube of Annie Ross singing Twisted. It's interesting to compare the two. And Annie Ross, an amazing vocalist, does it with a lot of drama and very acerbic. But with Joni, it's like it's a little more floaty. It's getting into that netherworld, that
Yeah.
broken middle, and then she.
But technically, she's solid.
Yeah,
think.
but then it's in partnership with that song Trouble Child, which is one of my favorite Joni songs. And that is a song about mental illness and institutionalization, sort of like Joan Didion's Play It As It Lays, but as a song. That's one way to think about it. And that, to me, is the jazz that I love of Joni, the jazz that's totally self-defined.
So let's move on. There's a rather long stretch of road next in Joni's musical journey that some have over the years considered kind of a fallow period. And we're talking about the
Can you see me roll my eyes?
the 1980s. Wild Things Run Fast from 82, Dog Eat Dog from 85, and Chalk Mark and a Rainstorm from 88. Now, of course, the Joni Mitchell fan, I never gave up on these records, and okay, there are a couple of clunkers, maybe, songs in here, but a lot of people did. And I just have to say that another thing I really appreciate about your book is how you kind of stood up for these albums, but more importantly, just explain the context and really have breathed new life into them, into records that were not only undervalued, but scorned by the critics, and record sales very low.
Yeah.
And I mean, you just do an expert job of guiding us through these. What is going on in the 80s with Joni?
Well, this connects with what I was just talking about. So during the making of Wild Things Run Fast, she and John Garand have separated a while back, but they still work together. And Jaco Pastorius was no longer really in a condition to play on this record. They were a great pair musically, but Jaco had a lot of struggles and just wasn't really able to do the sessions. So she needs a new bass player. So John has his friend, Larry Klein, this young guy, and brings him into the studio. And hey, you know, sparks start flying, musical sparks start flying.
And romantic sparks.
Read her, she married him. He's a lot younger than her. I mean, a lot. He was 25, what was she, 39, 40?
Could be. Yeah,
Maybe even older. I'm blanking on the age now. But those two, what happened on the record, I love the stories, you know, like they romance each other over playing pinball. So cute. But they were playing pinball, talking all night, and working together. And by the end of Wild Things Run Fast, it's just her and Larry and an engineer. That's the only people working on that record by the end. Larry was trying to transition out of his jazz career into something more like a rock career. And that appealed to her.
And it's interesting that they, you know, Mingus, this polarizing jazz record,
right,
a total 180, and she
Wild
puts
Things.
a great rock band together and basically releases a rock record.
Absolutely, and I love that record. And I love that record also for its romance, because there's some great, just like, I'm in love songs on that record.
But probably the record that people have the most problem with, I think, is the next one, Dog Eat Dog,
Yeah.
from 1985.
Yeah.
And this is kind of Joni's...
This is her synth pop record.
Yes,
this
exactly.
This is her Fairlight record. So, and I was lucky because I did end up having a little dialogue with Larry Klein. Initially, when I approached him, I do a lot of interviews in the book, by the way. I didn't talk to Joni Mitchell herself, but I talked to a lot of her collaborators. And I did, when I first met Larry, he's like, off the record. We had brunch, and I had to pay. I'm like, you're Larry Klein. Anyway, but whatever. How many Grammys do you have? Anyway, all good is my book. And so he didn't want to talk on the record. Years later, when I was working up the Larry chapter, the marriage chapter, I really found that I needed some information from him about the synths and the gear.
Right.
And that's how I got him to talk to me, the gear, because musicians love to talk about gear, don't they?
And boys and their toys.
Yeah.
Right?
But girls
Growing
and their
up,
toys,
yes.
because that's the thing. That's the thing that's so important and overlooked. One of two things I think that's so important and overlooked about Dog Eat Dog in particular, but also Chalk Mark and a Rainstorm, the next record, is that this is Joni at her techiest, at her gearheadiest. And she loved to experiment with synthesizers even in the 70s and tape loops. And she wanted to she admired Stevie Wonder. She considered him to be the example of where she wanted her music to go, but people around her, she says, led her a different direction. And in the 80s with Larry, that's when the synths come out, and they had a Fairlight, which is a very early synthesizer that could sample anything. If you like Kate Bush, the Fairlight, her masterpiece, The Dreaming, uses it extensively. But only like 3 people had a Fairlight, and Peter Gabriel was the other one. So you hear so much experimentation on that record musically, and that's what I love. And then the other thing, and I'm just rambling on, but I'll just say this, is the shift in technology and the music complements her shift in what she wants to do lyrically, which is that she wants to really get away from confessional songwriting and get into what she called more oracular songwriting, very political, and then embodying characters, which she'd done in the past, but never quite as much as she did, especially on Chalkmark.
Since the book has come out, we've all been reading the reviews, and I just have to quote the review that Elizabeth Nelson wrote in the Washington Post. There was a line about Dog Eat Dog that just was like this forehead slapping thing where she wrote, Mitchell was seeking a true synthesis with new wave as she had with jazz. Check out Fiction from Dog Eat Dog and imagine it as a New Order track. And I'm like, yes, that's so true.
You all have to follow Elizabeth on Twitter, if you're on, or X or whatever it's called, under Paranoid Style. She writes these great little pocket reviews of a lot of records. She's great, and that was a wonderful review. But that's a great point. And in fact, she worked with Thomas Dolby on that record, and later she denounced the record and said, Larry brought Dolby in, but they both loved his music, and they loved his album, The Flat Earth, and they loved his cover of I Scare Myself. Wait, he had a Joni cover. Anyway, I'm not remembering right now, but he had done a Joni cover, and anyway, but the point is, she not only worked with Thomas Dolby, but with Chalkmark, Larry was producing an album by Benjamin Orr of the Cars. So that's when she goes to England and hangs out there,
right.
meets hangs out with Peter Gabriel.
Does a wonderful duet with him
to
open
Secret
Chalkmark
Place.
in a rainstorm.
So beautiful. Yeah. So she's like a total new waver. And there's great photos of her and Larry in their like new wave t-shirts too. So go seek those out.
So I'm looking at the clock, and as much as I'd love to talk about one of my favorite Joni Mitchell albums, Shine, and the real late ones, I think there's one kind of obvious thing about Joni that perhaps doesn't get talked about as much as you might think, because we always talk about like the very, very obvious things, which is her amazing poetry and songwriting, and her strange chords, and her distinctive, singular guitar playing and things like that. But then, what's missing? The voice.
Yeah, yes.
Right from the very beginning, from the first albums, the voice is not only distinctive, but she's doing weird stuff with it.
It's true.
Like creating these, overdubbing herself to create these little choruses that are almost always just filled to the brim with, chromatic harmonies, dissonance.
Yeah.
Where is she getting that from?
That's a great question. That's a great, left field question. I don't know,
And she kept that throughout her career.
Yeah, I mean, the first record, which was produced by David Crosby, one thing they had in common was they were both jazz fans in that rock scene, and they weren't the only ones. But Crosby even had he worked with Terry Callier, who's a folk artist who also had jazz leanings. They both loved Coltrane, they both loved Miles Davis. So maybe partly, she found a peer in him and was feeling confident to bring out that side of her. And also, it's a little bit psychedelic. I think that period in Laurel Canyon, and I wanted to write a chapter about this, but the book was already so long. I wanted to write a chapter about the Beatles' influence in Laurel Canyon and on Laurel Canyon. The Beatles' publicist, Derek Taylor, was living in Laurel Canyon at the time and had a lot of influence in the scene. George Harrison lived on Blue Jay Way for a while, and they were all listening intensely to the Beatles. So I think that is something you hear, especially, I think, by the time she gets to Ladies of the Canyon. But I think that's one of the places she got that psychedelic thing.
Well, even on Woodstock,
Yeah.
with the end of Woodstock, where her voice is almost like almost in microtones or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that was a little bit polarizing about Joni fans too, because it almost seems to me that at least early on, you're either kind of like a Joni fanatic or you just don't get her. And sometimes I've had some friends over the years say, well, it's the voice sometimes that has gotten in the way. But for me, I think that the voice is, well, it's a multi-octave instrument, that's for sure.
Well, that's part of it too. Like, how do you not show off? It's like Simone Biles or something. You got to do those moves.
Right.
You know? I mean, I'll tell you a funny story too about those early records. So I mentioned Kate Bush. I was a massive and am a massive Kate Bush fan. Kate changed my life completely. And that was one reason why I didn't really get into Joni early on, I think, because I had Kate, and Kate was enough, felt like enough for me. So I did, when I started on this project and really sunk into those early albums, I went back and listened to the first 3 Kate Bush albums, which are my favorites. I know they're not everybody's. And I was like, oh my God, she took everything from Joni, and I didn't even know. I didn't even notice. So I had a little reckoning there. But good to be able to admit you're wrong when you're a critic.
This time is going so fast. But,
I know, we could talk all night.
I know, and I have a lot more questions. But I do, now that you've written this book, I'm wondering if you could zoom out a little bit for us and give us what you think is Joni's place in the context of popular music in the U.S.
That's a huge question.
I guess it's kind of like the legacy question.
Yeah,
right?
I spent a lot of time talking about how she puts together her legacy, and how she, by always sort of giving a twist to her legacy projects, like when she does her first Greatest Hits album, she also does a Greatest Misses album. When people start wanting to do tribute concerts to her, and this was she was working with Klein even though they were divorced. It's to strings, and now suddenly she's a torch singer. So she's always challenging herself and pushing herself forward, even in the process of legacy making, which I love. But that's a different question than what is her place.
Now we're a couple generations
past that stuff.
past all of that.
Yeah.
So there's almost these cycles that she's almost gone in these cycles of importance.
He's prompting me because we talked about this before. Remember the cycles thing? So
Knock, knock. It was so beautiful.
Well, yeah, I had this idea of this kind of gets to the women in music, the dreaded women in music question. I've spent a lot of my time thinking about over the many years I've been a music critic. And I think, let's just take it from the rock era, not consider the whole of American music, but the place of women in music and the relationship to the bigger picture changes kind of in a cyclical way over the history since when Joni started. So in her generation, women are pretty marginalized, although they are also having huge success. So they may, the girl groups give way to the Beatles, and suddenly rock is male. I'm not saying it really was, I'm saying that's what happened in the media and in the kind of public mind. So women are suddenly supposedly on the margins. In the folk revival, Dylan happens after Joan Baez was the biggest star, and suddenly folk is male, right? Dylan goes electric, and suddenly he's rock and folk is male. Funny. So during that period, her period of early fame, everyone agrees around her, all her peers, that she's the greatest, but she's a woman. So like, she can only be that kind of greatest, the greatest woman. Let's turn the wheel again, another generation. Let's go past the blockbuster years of the 80s into the 90s. In Joni's life, she is now entering the phase of her life where she could be a kind of cultural mother. And there's a new generation of women. Lilith Fair happens. Women in, I used to call this is when I was kind of in my young days as a national music critic. I called it the decade of the year of women in rock. Every year, it's like, let's write that story again. It's always new. It's always new that women matter as much as men. So there are these new women who want to claim her as a mother, but they also don't, because like they're daughters, and daughters have to reject their mother, right? And she also has a lot of trouble. She doesn't want to be that kind of mother to everyone. But then we have another turn of the wheel. Now we're going past the 2000s and into, let's go all the way to our present day. And now we have a different moment. And what I'm seeing is the daughters of the daughters of Rock Camp for Girls and of Lilith Fair mothers. And those women, the granddaughters of Joni, maybe even the great-granddaughters of Joni, they feel more comfortable acknowledging their elders. And now she, in her current state, seems very comfortable being acknowledged by women. And so now we have her great champion as a woman, Brandi Carlile, who's lifted her up so much. But I think this is something that's true about music in general, is that there's this beautiful manifestation of the lineage that I'm always seeing young women bringing older women on stage, and older women also acknowledging each other in ways that they didn't always, you know? So hopefully the next turn of the wheel, I don't know where it goes, but seems like progress.
Well, speaking of wheels turning, the wheels are almost have turned here, but we have a few questions from you folks that you submitted, so thank you very much for those. And here's a good one for you, Anne. I was going to ask this one, so I'm glad somebody else did. What was the most surprising thing you learned while writing the book?
Well, you know, on an overall sense, I think it was Joni's relationship to synthesizers and tech, and that she's such a gearhead and such a studio rat, you know? I really came to think of her as someone who lives her best life in the recording studio, which isn't really how I thought about her. I think she has some, at least when she was younger, there were some issues around performing for her. What do you think about that? Do you think that's true? Like Isle of Wight?
I did not think of her that way at all. That's why I love that chapter of the book, that, that she did turn out to be really into the gear, and like you say in the book, kind of almost like then having the Joni that we know and love, that voice kind of giving way to making that voice meld with the Fairlight and with the drum machine and stuff like that. So that was very interesting.
Yeah, but the other thing this is totally making another leap, but the other thing I discovered that I didn't know anything about, it's in this Humming the Wheels chapter, which is this sort of the folk revival era, and she's just a road dog during that time, traveling, moving, playing wherever. And the Coconut Grove stuff. That was fascinating. Yeah, and
totally.
I really
didn't know that at all.
Yeah, I want there to be like more on this, maybe their documentary, something. But in the late 60s, there was this mirror scene to Greenwich Village in Miami. And it was this neighborhood, Coconut Grove, that was like a historically black neighborhood and very bohemian also. And New York club impresarios actually opened clubs down there, sometimes with the same name. Like there was a famous folk club in New York called the Gaslight. There was a Gaslight in Coconut Grove. I just thought that was so interesting. I didn't know anything about that scene. And Joni went down there for a little while, and that's where she met David Crosby, who who was riding around in a cape like he would on his motorcycle.
And on his yacht.
And yes, on his
And so
yacht.
that Coconut Grove really, one of my favorite Joni Mitchell songs is The Dawn Treader.
Which is about David
which
on
is
his
about
yacht.
being on David's yacht.
And can I say, I don't know, we're live streaming this. I'm going to censor myself on this, but there's a great quote that I found. She calls her manager, Elliot Roberts. So she already had a manager, but she hadn't moved to California yet. And she says, listen, I'm effing a bird. That was David Crosby, because he'd been thrown out of the Byrds, but...
Ex-Bird, right.
Yeah, ex-Bird. So I loved learning about that, and I'd actually like to do more work on Coconut Grove. I think there's a great story there.
This next question, I think, is really interesting because as much of a Joni maven as I considered myself, I had a lot of blind spots. And I think there are probably some that still don't know that Joni Mitchell not only had a daughter that she gave up for adoption, but she reunited with this daughter. And this
Yes.
question says, can you talk a little bit about Joni's relationship with her daughter?
Yeah, I really thank whoever asked this question, because it gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit about adoption and who owns those stories. Oh my gosh, I'm getting emotional. Just like I did in the book in that story, but you have to read it to find that out. But so I'm an adoptive mom, and we have an open adoption. My daughter's now 20, and her birth mom lives in Oregon and has been a part of our lives since before baby was born. And one thing I've learned in the time raising my daughter and being part of an adoptive family, is that every adoption story belongs only to the people in that triad, in that family, and especially to the children and to the birth mothers. And so when I was working on the book, my editor they wanted a lot, what can we say about, you're an adoptive mom, you're going to write a big blowout chapter on that. Well, I do write about it, but I say that very strongly. I will never know, I cannot know, and nor can any of us know why Joni entrusted her daughter in adoption, nor can we really know whether that drove her, whether that fed her ambition. We don't know that much about the feelings, the connection, the feelings of connection and disconnection that occurred when her daughter, whom she named Kelly Dale, and her adopted parents named Caloran, did reunite. Her daughter found her in the way that adopted kids often do when records are sealed, which I am against very strongly. And when they reunited, it was beautiful, and it was also very public. And I think that was hard, I think that was hard by their own account for both of them. So, I will just let Joni speak for herself, because I think this quote that she has about that experience says something about the incredible sacrifice and beauty and loss and grief of being a birth mom, which I don't know about myself, but she said after Caloran found her and they were reunited, she went into a session with Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock, and they said, something's changed in your voice. And she said, all I can say is that something in me, a hole was filled. So, wow. Yeah, that's, it's a really important story, and it's a private story, but it's also, I think, an important story in her evolution.
And I loved how you treated that in the book.
Thank you so much.
Telling a little bit of your story as well.
Yeah, you'll have to read it for that scene.
I think we have time for one last question. We'll have to make it short. And the question is, do you have a favorite song or album, and does that differ from before the book?
Yes. Well, you have to go first. What's your favorite song or album? Does it differ from before you read my book, which changed your life?
Well, I did, very quickly, I did, again, I think you really reinforced the 80s records for me again.
Yeah.
And I've come back to dog eat dog since reading the book and giving it a more critical listen after reading the book. And so I think that's my answer.
Oh, that's a great one. Obviously there's no one answer to this question, but I don't know, when I started the project, I did a bunch of interviews at the Joni 75 special that happened at Disney Hall, the tribute, and at that point my favorite was A Strange Boy, partly because Seal's version kills of that song.
Yeah,
he gave it that night. I like that song because it's a weird little moment on his era, and I still haven't solved the mystery of who is the strange boy exactly. We know that it's an idol, it's a passing thing in Joni's life, someone she traveled with briefly. Some people say an airline steward.
But, really?
But I like that song too, I think because it's a rock song, it's a killer song. But so that was my favorite for a while. Then the Larry years came. Well, okay, Jazz Fusion came, and probably Jungle Line, that's an early one, or Dreamland, with Shaka Khan's amazing background vocals. But then most recently, and I've been thinking again about the adoption stuff, Stay in Touch, I think, which is a song from Taming the Tiger that she didn't write for Kaloran, but she actually wrote it for her then companion, Donald Freed, she said. But that is a song about the beginning of a relationship. And it's such a great, it's got that Joni thing of the balance between I'm reaching out, I'm pulling back, and isn't that how it is when you're starting a new love, a new friendship, a new whatever? It's like, is this going to work? Is that going to work? I'm not going to put myself on the line, but maybe I should. And it's just so great,
Like she said, I think it was in Black Crow. The words are something like love, something about for love and music. My whole life has been corruption, diving down to figure out every
any
shining
shiny thing.
Every shiny thing. So, almost she tells us about her. She's always seems to be searching for love, and yet balancing that with how to continue her art.
Yeah.
And I think you've done a great job in the book of both of those things, about her life, her work, her art. And we've come to the end of our time, and I thank everybody for coming and for submitting questions. And Anne, congratulations again on a wonderful book.
Before you applaud, I have one more thing to say about that, because I just can't stop talking, and we have 3 more minutes. So, one thing I want to say is I've been giving a few of these talks, and it's great to talk Joni. First of all, welcome to the world of music nerdery. It's like, this is what we do all day long. It's really fun. But I think living inside someone else's life is super weird, and living inside the life of a living person is super weird, and that was daunting with this project. But what her art gives us is this incredible view of the inside of the head, in a sense, the thought process, And you brought up Black Crow, so I had to say that, because the other thing that's so important to me, that's become so important to me about Joni's music, is its spiritual questing. It's questing toward, which I just consider engagement with mystery and with the mystery within, right? And that song is a great example, because that phrase is really about the Buddhist idea of, the human need for possession and how that entraps us. She wrote it at a time when she was very interested in Buddhism. She's very educated in this matter. So I just say, you said she's a life coach for you, and I think she's a great, I don't want to call her a guru, but she's a great spiritual companion. Let's leave it at that.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you.
What a great interviewer. Let's hear it for Tom. So I'm going to be signing books in the hallway or wherever in the lobby. So come find me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
That was fun.
That was fun. Whoops.
I